The photograph failed first. It did not fail with drama. It failed the way a conversation fails when everyone suddenly misremembers the same word. In the negative, where his eyes ought to have been, where all photographs put the soul at risk by fixing it to a place and time, there was a gray that had the texture of rain. Not a blot, exactly, but a smear like a thumb dragged on glass. When the apprentice at the printer's bench lifted the plate, his face went the color of the room after a lamp is extinguished. Quick, small, the kind of color that means calculation. He apologized, then apologized again, as if apology could unmake an absence. We married in late October, when the light has the mercy to be wan. The sacristy smelled of beeswax and lemon oil. The pews were polished in 100 small motions. The mother-of-pearl keys of the organ glimmered with rehearsed faux modesty. My mother taught me how to appear modest. My father taught the ledger how to be exact. Both lessons were a kind of choreography. There is a movement to good social life. An entrance timed to a half-beat before a laugh, an apology framed to return the spotlight to someone else, a hand lifted so a hat might clear the face without seeming to look. I had learned those things well enough to make a life of them, but the smear on the negative refused choreography. It refused to be shaped into the kind of narrative we kept in our house: neat cause, tidy consequence, a statement, and a remedy. Instead, it was weather, an accidental meteorology that fell on the party and lingered. People asked the wrong questions as a matter of habit. That is how gossip begins, not with malice but with an eager filling of blanks. The printer apprentice, a boy with a respectable shyness, had been apprenticed in the city. He had come recommended by the photographer, a man who liked to use assistants whose hands were steady and who, crucially, would bow neatly to the demands of a client. The photographer, the sort of man who prefers the night to the middle of the day, who whispers about light like a theologian, was mortified in a different, very public way. He offered to retake the portrait. He offered to destroy the negative. He offered to meet the press. He offered every kind of remedy that has a headline. My mother, who organizes fundraisers the way other people plan their meals, composed her sentences into press-proof instruments, soft but authoritative, regretful but focused on the future rather than the stain. My father, who keeps 3 ledgers and 2 wills in a drawer that opens with a practiced weight, asked for proof, for receipts, for an accountable chain. They worked as they knew best: containment. Containment is a domestic art as much as a legal one. It is a way to put things into boxes, statements, denials, apologies, so the town can file them alphabetically and move on. The steward, who keeps the real ledger and not the ones my father keeps for the bank, watched these maneuvers with a patience that had the weight of oak. He is older than people need to be in a town where offices close early, and everyone goes home to their ornaments. He had been the steward of the family's ledger for a generation longer than anyone could remember. He believes in obligations as if they were weights to be measured, and he measures them by the slow method of practice, not by pronouncement. It is not the ledger that will break, he told me one evening in the archive, where the lamps throw a halo over paper and the smell of book glue is an honest perfume. He said this without looking at my face, which is the solitude of people who have seen the same crisis repeated in generations. There is grief, there is outrage, there is the quick offering of public answers, and then there is the ledger, folding all of it into the quiet arithmetic of names. The ledger is merely honest. It keeps doing what ledgers do. It records. The danger is the way people read the ledger as a verdict. He placed a cheap, firm hand on the glass case where the family ledger rested, as though steadying it. The ledger had the look of being important by not being ostentatious. Thick, cloth-bound, its spine crackled with the time taken to open and close it. Marginalia crowded some pages like late snow, the notes of stewards past, the ink of women who had once been called seamstresses and now had their names hashed in an account. I had opened the ledger once, under supervision, and found that the margins were the town's true memory. The ledger did not just list debts and houses. It recorded names in the smallest and most dignified measures. Who had mended a child's sleeve, who had sent a beam of wood in a season of rain, who had taught a boy to read. Those marginalia read like prayer. "You are, by training, a social animal," the steward observed. You have the reflex to make things public. You know how to move our grief into speech and ceremony. That is a useful art. The question now is how to balance it with care." He turned his palm to the ledger as if to feel its heat. "Choice is more interesting than inheritance." He said the sentence, blunt as a tool, as if to test whether I would catch the blade. He did not mean that inheritance is useless. He had too much respect for the past to say such a thing. He meant instead that being given something is different from taking it, and the ledger at our house had long been the locus where inheritance and duty blur. If a deed is given, the deeds follow. If a task is chosen, the task remains alive only as long as the chooser is alive to tend it. The smear, I realize now, was the moment when these distinctions began to press against one another. The photograph asked that the public assign a face. The ledger asked in its own way that a private hand answer for what responsibilities would be carried forward. They were not the same assignment. The world wanted spectacle. The ledger wanted work. Rumor is a small animal. It breeds quickly in the corners where people are watching the same newsreel and have nothing else in their mouths. The town did what towns do. The baker, a woman who measures flour by sight and grief by season, asked me if this would mean the end of everything. The gardener folded his palm into his, as if to measure whether this scandal would cool the soil. The church warden whispered that some people had said the smear looked intentional. Others said it was a sign. Neither the whisper nor the sign helped the ledger. It continued to wait. At first I reacted as the socialite is trained to react, with strategy. I drew up statements of calm. I practiced the smile that signals competence without triumph. The stances I had rehearsed over the years, an easy laugh, a shoulder slant towards the wronged party, a deflective anecdote, felt suddenly inadequate. The smear refused my choreography. It was a small gray absence that made the room tilt. There were practical things to do. The photographer wanted to make amends. He brought the apprentices and their prints to the house. He knelt in reverence to my mother's arrangements and promised to consult with the best retoucher available. The lawyer, a solicitor with hands like careful instruments, drafted an addendum to the prenuptial covenant in a language that pleased my father. Custodial assignment, voluntary custodianship, annual affirmation. He used these words with a kind of soothing insistence, as if by saying them aloud we could transmute the messy human questions into boxes with check marks. We signed things while the rain kept its slow time against the windows. In the evenings, when the house softened and the lamps threw halos across the hallway rugs, I would take the negative from the photographer's assistant, wrapped in a small paper envelope. I would sit at the kitchen table with the kettle boiling and hold it up to the lamp. The smear looked different each time I tilted it. Sometimes it was an erased place. Sometimes it appeared like a shadow that had been lifted by a glove. Rain, when it is steady, changes all angles. I asked Elliot once, in the quiet between the press calls and the legal advice, if he wanted the portrait to be retaken. He did not look at the negative when I asked. He folded his hands around a strip of thread and said quietly, "I don't mind being absent from my own photograph." It was the kind of answer that requires an interpreter. I could have read it as resignation, as a refusal of the show. I could have read it as acquiescence to the pressure that followed, an attempt to disappear so as to spare me a headline. The truth is, we both wanted different things from the same moment, and that is the beginning of a whole new set of obligations. He wanted to retreat into the work he had always done, but never named as central. Bookbinding, for him, had always been more than a trade. It was a way to enact humility. He taught with his hands how to punch holes through gatherings, how to fold the signatures so the spine might hold, how to talk to the paper before you stitched it. He was apprenticed to someone who taught him to treat a book as a body, and he believed, in the way some people believe in prayer, that tending a book was tending a life. His retreat was not dramatic. It was not the sort of thing that makes headlines. He began to close himself off to the drawing room and take long hours in the back room that housed the archive, a small, cool place behind my father's study, lined with shelves and boxes where the ledger lived under glass. The house where we had rehearsed public life had in its belly this private room whose labors were measured by a few stubborn tools. Bone folders, linen thread, pounce, a jar of glue whose skin formed each afternoon like a domestic moon. He took to the ledger with that same gentleness. The steward watched him without comment. The steward comes from a time when people accept that some tasks are unglamorous and necessary. He also knows that those tasks, performed with fidelity, have a moral force that cannot be televised. "We keep names," he said to Elliot one afternoon, as they leaned over a page with marginal notes in a coppery hand. "We do not sell them. We keep them." He tapped the spine of the ledger in a way that meant, this is not to be commodified. There was an offer from a foundation the size of a small bank, one of those philanthropic trusts that buys names as if collecting rare documents were equivalent to tending memory. They offered to put the smear in a climate-controlled exhibit, a curiosity, a case study in public scandal and image. The offer came with a stipend that would make the ledger, our family's accumulation of small histories, become part of a wider, curated narrative. They wanted to display the negative as an emblem of modern social fragility. Elliot refused. He refused carefully and without flourish. He sat the letter on the desk between us and folded his hands on it like a person who believes in the materiality of refusal. "You can refuse something," he said, "not to the steward or the solicitor, but to me. And that refusal can protect a place." He did not claim moral high ground. He simply declined the offer as if he were closing a book. The consequences were immediate. The foundation had promised to underwrite a conservation studio and to fund an apprentice. Without their funds, some plans we had discussed in the soft, convenient language of possibility had to be reconsidered. My mother sighed in a way that was almost operatic for her and began to do what she knows best, plan a smaller domestic fundraising tea. My father recalculated the budgets and asked whether the ledger could be sustained on the same margins as before. Stewardship, I learned, has a price in the currency of mundanity. While the world's machines clicked, Elliot's work sustained a private gravity. He began copying letters, hundreds of them sometimes, by hand. He would sit at the simple table in the archive under a lamp, his head bowed, and transcribe the marginal voices. The seamstress who had once mended the hem of a child's coat and left a note in the ledger. The carpenter who had logged a donation of wood during a bad spring. The young woman who had recorded the name of a midwife. These were not grand narratives. They were the small arithmetic of town life. The letters he transcribed were often crooked, written in haste by hands that had other lives to live. Elliot inserted them into codicils, into protective sleeves, and they accumulated weight not as headlines but as presence. I began to watch him. In the drawing room, I was the social animal, moving in a choreography of greetings and goodbyes. In the archive, he was a different kind of animal, one that responds to the quiet work of keeping. I found myself curious in an entirely new way, the way a person learns to watch a stitch without wanting to be the stitcher. The kettle became more significant to me than any bouquet because its whistle marks a pause, a time for reading the margin rather than composing a speech. My apprenticeship was not a grand renunciation. I did not burn the dresses I wore to charity balls. Instead, I learned the small things first. The bookshop owner, Mr. Hollis, a man whose hands smelled permanently of dust and orange wax polish, taught me how to glue the spine without making it show. He showed me the right way to cut interleaving tissue so that it would not wrinkle when the ink expanded in humidity. He had a way of looking at a person that made you feel, briefly, like an amateur who might become an artisan if you were patient enough. "Attention," he said when I complained of my clumsy fingers. "It is all attention. You must pretend the paper is a living client. Move as if you do not have anywhere else to be." So I began to make tea at the appointed hours, to set out a small cloth on the table in the archive, to arrange the spoons and cups with the sort of care I had once reserved for table settings on the day of a reception. The rituals were modest. A kettle brought to boil, the spoon set across the cup handle so the tea would not spill as I carried it, a cloth to catch tiny drips. There was also a ledger of my own making, a small notebook in which I wrote the names of people whose lives I wanted to remember. I wrote the seamstress's name, the date she had mended a child's coat, the odd little note she'd left about how she preferred cotton to wool. My list was clumsy, a socialite's attempt at humility, but the act of writing made remembering deliberate. These small domestic acts changed what I could hold in my hands. The smear, which had once felt like an accusation, became something else in the archive's lamplight. It became a question that would not be answered by a press release. Sometimes, late at night, there would be a sound from the archive. The soft pull of thread, the scrape of a bone folder across paper. I would stand at the doorway and listen, as if to learn the rhythm of a life being made up of small, honorable acts. There was sorrow in it, but also a steadiness I had not yet learned to name. The lawyer came once, a cool day when the rain had stopped but left the air hung with a damp that made the house hush. He sat in my husband's study and spoke of clauses and contingencies in the precise voice of someone who likes the world as a series of solvable problems. He proposed language for a custodial assignment that made my father relieved and my mother bristle. Voluntary custodianship, he said, tapping the page as if it were a metronome. Annual affirmation, delegable duties but not delegable obligations. When he used the word delegable, my mother grimaced as a person does when a seam shows in a way she cannot quite hide. We must be sure, she insisted. We cannot allow an image, however unfortunate it is, to determine who bears the ledger. That is precedent. The steward, who came in from his errands and sat quietly, said nothing for a long moment. When he did speak, he said it in a way that simplified things rather than complicating them. We have always been choosing people to do this work, he said. The point is not to stop choosing. The point is to make sure the choosing is honest. That phrase lodged in me. Choosing is honest because it forces the chooser to own the task. Inheritance is slippery because it allows people to step back and say, it is what we do. But the smear did not belong to the ledger at all. It belonged to the space of spectacle. Spectacle wants faces and verdicts. Stewardship wants hours and patience. They are different economies. It was in the slow rotation between these economies that my own life adjusted. At receptions, I found myself more interested in listening than in leading conversation. I let other people craft the proper word for the newspapers while I learned to fold a book cloth without making that seam look like a scar. The household shifted in other ways too. Our cooks began to notice that the hours in which Elliot worked were quieter. He asked for hot broth instead of the fussier food he had once enjoyed at gatherings. He spoke to the younger archivist, an eager woman with quick hands and slow speech, about repair techniques and, with a kind of solemn modesty, taught her the right way to sew a signature so that the spine could breathe. Rumors, though, do not respect the slow work of repair. They hurry along telephone lines. They have a taste for scandal the way some people have a taste for sweets. There were op-eds in the regional papers, paragraphs that claimed to consider the smear in a sociological light and instead simply fed the hunger for a story. Parishioners who had once applauded my mother's committees peered at me with a curiosity that felt, in some corners of the town, almost sorrowful. The local vendors exchanged glances over counters as if the photograph had moved from the negative to their shelves where it might affect the way they served their customers. I learned to let it wash over me. What is public is slippery by nature. What is private is stubborn and slow. The ledger insisted on that slowness. When Elliot would hand me a sheet he had transcribed, a letter from a seamstress about a missing button, a note about a child's temper, my chest constricted in a way I had once reserved for a difficult dress fitting. It was not that these notes were grand, it was that they required something of me that the drawing room did not. Patience. The town assumed that our family would set things to rights with statements and charm, and perhaps they were right for a short time. But the smear did something else. It made visible a choice that had already been happening in the soft hours of our house. It made me see how unequal our division of labor had been, how the public life had fallen to me with my mother's blessing, and how the private life had been Elliot's to keep. That inequality had not seemed unfair until an absence confronted us with the difference. Did he choose to withdraw? Was he pushed? Could love survive when one person preferred the light and the other preferred the dust? I do not pretend I had an answer then. What I had was a question that would not be spoken in the press. Is choosing someone an act that must be renewed? Or is it a single signature on a day sealed with cake and white flowers? The stewardship he offered, its slow, unshowy rituals, was not what my mother and my father had imagined when they drew up our contract. It was something else entirely. The solicitor could write clauses out in language that would look nice on paper, but he could not write the hours Elliot would spend at the ledger transcribing letters in copper ink. One afternoon, weeks after the smear first showed itself like weather, I walked to the archive with a cup of tea and the negative wrapped in paper. The kettle's whistle at home had been a call to calm. Here it felt like a challenge. I slipped the envelope from my bag and held the negative to the lamplight. Elliot was there, hunched over a page, and his hands, when he looked up, were ink-stained at the tips. He did not seem surprised to see me. He made a small movement with his chin toward the ledger and then back to the page he was copying. "You're still keeping those," I said, perhaps too lightly. I placed the negative on the table between the lamp and the ledger. The smear looked like something absorbed by the paper's suggestion of memory. The lamp halo softened the gray. He nodded. "Names," he said. "They accumulate. Someone ought to keep them." "Is that what you think you're doing?" I asked, not certain whether I wanted a confession or a conversation. He considered the question as if weighing thread. "I think keeping is a way of saying yes to someone, over and over. I write their words down so they are there when nobody else remembers the day of the repair or the aunt who taught a child to read." "Do you write because you want to, or because there was pressure? Because of the smear?" The question felt like pinprick. It was not that I wanted to force his hand. It was that I was beginning to recognize how the ledger and the smear had placed different expectations on both of us. He folded a corner of the page and looked at me. His eyes, when they found mine, were clear as water after rain. "I choose it," he said. The answer was simple. It did not resolve everything. There was, in it, a note of something like defiance and possibly of surrender. It was, as all human answers are, layered. I could not tell then whether he could have chosen differently if the world had not pressed on us in such a public way. I could not tell whether his choice was entirely free or whether the ledger offered an escape that was also an ethic. I knew only that the house had shifted. The choreography I had learned was not always useful here. If a social animal learns to be an apprentice, something has altered in the anatomy of the marriage. That night, I slept badly and woke with the taste of lemon oil in my mouth from the memory of the ledger. The next morning, I set a cloth on the archive table and arranged the tea service as if I had been doing it for years. Elliot arrived with a packet of letters and a small folded page that had once been the seamstress's ledger entry. I poured the tea and smelled the steam and watched him as he smoothed the paper with the same care he used on the leather of a spine. He slid one of the letters toward me. It was a note about a child's lost shoe and the woman who had fixed it. There was a brief line, just one sentence, that read like a prayer. "Made right by hand." I found in that sentence a small defiant politics that did not know the language of publicity. I could feel myself leaning into it. I could feel the social animal and the apprentice both trying on new clothes. At the doorway, unnoticed until that moment, the steward lingered. He had the habit of arriving at the right moments with no announcement. He smiled in the way people do when they are not surprised by change. "You will find," he said to me, "that keeping things changes the person who keeps them." He placed his hand on the ledger and then, after a beat, on mine. It was not a theatrical gesture. It was small and precise, like setting a stitch, and yet the smear still sat on the table. It had not been explained away. It had not even been discussed in terms that would satisfy the town. It was a small gray absence, an image that insisted on being weather. You could either make it into a shrine, or you could feed it into the slow work of naming. We were beginning to choose the latter. After that day, I started to visit the archive more often on purpose. I had always thought of myself as someone who performed public life. Now I learned how to keep quiet and watch a hand stitch. Mr. Hollis showed me how to prepare glue so that it will not flake. Elliot taught me to fold signatures with a patience that calmed the joints. The steward lent me a pair of work-worn gloves and said, "Don't be afraid to get dust on your hands. Dust is memory trying to be held." The house adjusted to these new small rituals. Invitations still came, windows were still set with flowers, My mother's committees still demanded my presence, but there was a parallel rhythm in the back rooms that softened the public edges. People began, slowly, to ask me questions about seamstresses and midwives in the ledger rather than the photograph. The town, hungry for the next headline, flattened out in places, and in others it deepened where names were kept and read aloud in a steady voice. A week after I had first begun to apprentice in earnest, a columnist in the city paper wrote a piece that was part mockery, part anthropology, about the scandal. He described the smear as a metaphor for modern anxieties and used phrases like parochial melodrama and theatrical withdrawal. He did not come to the archive. He would not have understood what we were doing there. He would not have the patience to watch a hand stitch for the half hour it takes to close a cover. His words were loud and thin, like sugar dissolving, quickly there and quickly gone. But rumor does not die when the journalist forgets his own story. It migrates. People in the market still covered their mouths when the subject came up. A few parishioners invited me to coffee and asked, with the careful cruelty of people who fear discomfort, whether Elliot had been made to withdraw. I answered them with the simplest truth I had, that he had chosen to do the work, and that choices require renewal. It would have been convenient to have a public reconciliation, a photograph with both of us smiling, and the smear excised by the retoucher into a saccharine invisibility. But I had started to learn that invisibility is a poor currency for memory. When you remove marks, you often remove the thing that tells you a life was lived. I could see too late, perhaps, how easily we might erase the seamstress's marginalia in pursuit of a prettier public image. So we refused to let the photograph be the only story. We began to build another, the slow sequence of small acts that make up stewardship. I drafted a list of names I wanted to preserve. Elliot and the steward and I sat in the archive and read aloud the entries and decided sometimes to follow up with the people mentioned, a great-granddaughter of a seamstress who came to tea, a young gardener who repaired pews for the parish. We did modest, unpublicized acts that shifted the ledger from an inheritance to a practice that could be shared. There were moments of friction. My mother wanted a statement that would put the rumor out of its misery. My father wanted an accounting of costs. The solicitor wanted the language of annual affirmation to be explicit and enforceable. The steward wanted things to remain less contractual and more voluntary. Each position had a logic. It was the form of an argument I had not anticipated. A moral debate about how memory is maintained, dressed in the practical language of ledgers and contracts. One afternoon in the archive, Elliot handed me a thin packet of folded pages. "I have been copying letters for months," he said. "You do not have to read them now, but please keep them somewhere." I held the packet as if it were a delicate thing. The letters were not about great deeds. They were about little things, buttons reattached, beds mended, apples shared. Yet, as I read them under the lamp, I felt as if I had been given a map to hidden parts of a town. Each line was a hand reaching out. "Why are you doing this?" I asked finally, when my voice could find the room to be honest. He looked at me, and for the first time perhaps, allowed the possibility of being seen without pretending to perform. "Because someone has to," he said simply. "Because the ledger asks to be fed. Because those names deserve more than being the footnote of someone else's story." I could object on many grounds, that he had retreated instead of fighting in the drawing room, that he had chosen a life that would make the town suspect our marriage, that perhaps his choice had been made easier by suffering that I could not know. But when I looked at the letters and felt the weight of them in my hands, I thought of the seamstress's single sentence, "Made right by hand." There was a stubborn nobility to that idea that made a kind of sense to me. We began to make small practical changes. I would sit with him as he worked. I would fold the interleaving tissue and smooth the papers. I learned to hold the bone folder at the angle that keeps the paper from buckling. He taught me to make a head cap so the top of a book would not fray. These were not monumental acts. They were stitches, literal and figurative. Each stitch was an affirmation. At night, sometimes, I took the negative from my drawer and contemplated the smear. The lamp in the bedroom would make the gray glow like a cloud. There was, I had to admit, a small delight in keeping something unresolved. The smear would not let me grow complacent. It reminded me of the limits of performance. It reminded me that some things could not be fixed by a well-turned phrase or a rebuke in the press. When people asked what we would do next, I began to answer differently. I stopped promising the town a narrative that would be easy to sum up. Instead, I started to speak of practices, the monthly reading of the ledger in which we would call out names and, when possible, make arrangements with those mentioned to meet their needs. I spoke of apprenticeships and small repairs and of refusing the foundation's offer, not to be sanctimonious, but because we did not want to hand memory to a tableau that would make a show of our grief. It was not that we were moralists in the grand sense. It was rather that in the face of an image that wanted to become a verdict, we chose a less glamorous thing, to keep names, to feed the ledger, to do the small acts that make up a life. The social animal moved slowly toward apprenticeship. The ledger, stubborn and unglamorous, continued to open its pages. One evening, as rain began again and the house settled into its usual hush, Elliot closed a packet of letters and slid it into a small box. He set the box on the ledger's shelf and drew the dust sheet over it as if we were laying a shroud that would never be read by curious hands. He did not tell me what would happen to those letters. He did not have to. The point was not ownership, but care. I left the archive that night holding the negative. The smear sat on the paper like a weather that had found a home. I thought of the steward's words about choice and inheritance and felt, for the first time, that the marriage we had rehearsed would require different performances. The title the town had given us, of scandal and absence, felt less binding in the hush of the back rooms. We had chosen to refuse spectacle and to keep names. There was, however, a question that would not leave me. It sat like a small stone in my throat and was not amenable to being swallowed. If Elliot had chosen this life, how did I become the kind of person who would continue to choose him in the slow way this stewardship required? Could love be a series of renewals, each tender and mundane and lacking headline appeal? Or had I already chosen once on a day of ceremony, and now I must act on that choice without the rhetorical flourish I once relied upon? The answer, if there was one, would not arrive with the retoucher's skill or the solicitor's language. It would arrive as the ledger demanded, through practice, through repetition, through the stubborn arithmetic of attention. There would be no one scene to make this tidy. There would be only a long set of small acts. I was learning to be patient with that expectation. Outside, rain drew lines down the window. The smear on the negative looked like a cloud passing across a familiar face. Inside, the ledger rested under glass, patient as a patient thing. I placed my palm over its cover and felt the pulse of history there, a slow, insistent beat that asked for care rather than headlines. When I turned from the archive that night, I did not know how the town would decide to remember us. I did not know whether the smear would forever be read as a verdict or whether it would fade like weather, a small thing people remembered vaguely and without malice. I only knew that the house had changed its rhythm and that I, who had been the social animal for so long, was learning the craft of keeping. The shadow, as the town preferred to call it, the smear, the story, the suspicion, remained. It did not leave. But in the quiet, in the small domestic liturgies we began to practice, I could feel that its shape had begun to be reframed. Later, after the solicitor had drawn up his clauses and the steward had muttered that choosing is more interesting than inheritance, a different practice began to take hold. Before I signed anything else on behalf of the house, before I wrote another statement for the press, I would ask myself what name I was keeping and why. The camera wanted a cleaned face. The ledger wanted a named, sustained life. I had been trained to please a room. Now I was learning to keep a page. At the end of that month, as the leaves turned and the rain softened to memory, I found a note tucked between the pages of the ledger where the seamstress's marginalia had been recorded. The line, written in a hand that trembled slightly, said, "Do not let our names be sold." It was not a command exactly. It read like a plea. I folded the page against my chest and walked to the archive where Elliot worked. He looked up and, without the need for ceremony, took my hand. Outside, the town still gossiped and the papers still kept their angles. Inside, with hands smudged from glue and a kettle warming on the stove, we began, very quietly, what the ledger asked us to do. And so the weather continued. The smear remained a gray that would not sit easily in any gallery. The title the town gave us, the Socialite and the shadow that never left, hung in the air like a verdict and a question. I was, willingly and with a certain discomfited joy, attempting to be both parts of it at once. I would continue to attend receptions and to fold signatures. I would continue to answer the press with the measured sentences of a woman who knows how to move a room. I would also, in the slow hours of the archive, learn to keep. The ledger demanded it. The smear reminded me of my limits. The next morning, I found a letter on the doorstep addressed to the steward. It bore the crest of the foundation and smelled faintly of museum polish. Someone in the town had sent it before breakfast, confident and quick. The steward opened it with a small, polite smile and read the polite, persuasive language aloud. They still wanted to curate, to display, to put the smear in a light that made it educational. They proposed a grant that would be tempting to anyone who thinks big. Elliot listened, fingers folded. I watched him as I had watched him stitch, counting the tremor in his jaw and the steadiness of his breath. He had refused once already. Could he refuse again, if refusing meant living in more modest financial circumstances? The ledger we tended was not funded by foundations. It was fed by hours and thrift. Choosing, I was learning, sometimes costs money. Sometimes it costs prestige. The steward placed the letter gently on top of the ledger as if it were a thin piece of news. He turned to us both and, with the small gravity he reserved for important things, said again, "Choice is more interesting than inheritance." I knew then that the fight to keep things would not be merely sentimental. It would be political in the smallest sense. Decisions about resources, decisions about who would receive support, decisions about who would sit at the table when the accounts were read, who would sign for coal and seed, who would be sent a note instead of a telegram. These were small things, and yet the argument that followed felt, for a time, as if it were about everything. My mother favored the foundation's letter as one favors a well-cut dress. It promised to simplify, to lift the awkwardness off our shoulders, to give the house a certain cultivated sheen. My father, who trusted numbers the way other people trusted prayers, sketched scenarios in the margins of his own ledgers and kept returning to a single practical question. Without that promised endowment, how would we cover the cost of conservation and an apprentice? The solicitor, efficient and pale, produced another draft with more clauses than the first and a little flourish of legal optimism. He read it to us aloud in the drawing room, his voice making the terms sound like an accord of instruments. Custodial assignment, he said. Voluntary custodianship. Annual affirmation. Each phrase landed like a small coin on the table. I listened for a long while as if I were learning to hear a new language. The words were useful, necessary even. But the steward's voice kept returning in my head. Choice is more interesting than inheritance. It is a blunt sentence, but it had the clarity of a tool. I found myself thinking less about the tidy phrasing the solicitor preferred and more about the practice those phrases promised to hold together. We convened a family meeting in the old oak-paneled room, the one where my mother had once practiced composing speeches by the light of a hurricane lamp. The solicitor placed his paper as if to draw a formal map. My father opened a ledger to the year's accounts and pointed to line items. My mother found a tone that was equal parts thrift and rhetorical flourish. It is difficult to describe how civil such arguments can be. Each of us wanted to be reasonable and, beneath that politeness, to be right. When it was my turn to speak, I did not stand at a podium or make a declaration. I spoke quietly about what I had learned in the back rooms, that names are not simply entries, and that to preserve them was to accept an ongoing task rather than a one-time triumph. I told them plainly that if we accepted the foundation's money, we risked turning private endurance into a public exhibit, that the ledger might be put behind glass and presented as an object rather than a set of practices. I spoke of the seamstress's plea, folded and faint, that begged not to have its name sold. Elliot sat beside me, and when he spoke as he always did, without flourish and with a precision that could not be mistaken for placidity. Custodial assignment in an account book is not the same as custodianship in a life, he said. I am willing to accept a formal role, but only if there is a promise that the work will be revisited, that the person keeping the names may change their mind, annually if need be. that the decision remain voluntary and reviewed, not a deed written once and sealed forever. The solicitor nodded as if this were a reasonable request. He amended his draft slowly in the room, his pen scratching like a compass finding new course. He wrote the phrases into the document, then translated them in plain language so that my father could understand their practical reach. In effect, he said, this means the custodial assignment will be voluntary and must be affirmed annually by the custodian. Duties may be delegated where necessary, an apprentice, an assistant, but the moral obligation to choose cannot be ceded. There is a mechanism for review. Delegable duties, but not delegable obligations, I repeated, testing the cadence. It sounded in my mouth like a modest vow. My mother raised an eyebrow. And if the custodian refuses to affirm? If someone declines on moral or practical grounds? She asked, thinking of calendars and fundraising schedules. The steward answered before Elliot did, with the soft oracle voice he reserved for important things. Then you choose again, he said. You do not assume. You ask. You listen. That was the compromise we took, to accept the solicitor's framework, but to insist upon language that preserved the daily reality of care. The addendum read, in plain terms that my father found comforting. The person responsible for custodianship would be appointed by the family. That appointment would be voluntary. It would carry an obligation to affirm each year in writing. And while the practical duties could be delegated to apprentices, the core moral choice, who stands to say yes, cannot be assigned away. The idea of an annual affirmation felt, I recognized, like a small ritual we could invent, a modest liturgy to unite our domestic life and our legal papers. We signed the addendum on a day when rain measured the house into soft lines. After the solicitor left, we poured tea and folded the document as if it were a fresh page in the ledger. The steward placed his hand over the paper, and then on mine. Choice is more interesting than inheritance. He had said it to me once, but when he said it with the weight of ink and signatory, it became law in a new way, one that still left room for human unpredictability. The steward announced his intention to retire not long after. Retirement, in his case, meant a long-drawn farewell rather than an abrupt exit. He came to the archive with a small bundle wrapped in brown paper and placed it on the table as if it were a jewel. In that bundle were items that had nothing to do with bank accounts. Gloves worn at the cuff, a tape measure smoothed by years of use, a tiny bone folder nicked at the tip. He had been the keeper of the ledger for a generation. His hands knew the weight of names. You have the ledger now, he told Elliot in a voice that did not tremble but held a particular sort of warmth. Not in a legal sense, no document binds you to it, but in the way that matters. I taught you not because I needed to leave, but because one day you should teach someone else. That is how things are kept. One hand passes knowledge to another. We threw a small gathering that afternoon, the sort of unobtrusive ritual that my mother could arrange with tasteful restraint. Tea, a small cake, chairs set in a circle that refused to feel like an audience. The town sent its usual representatives. The bookshop owner with his thin smile, the parish warden who brought a newspaper clipping as a kind of offering, the gardener with soil still clinging to his nails. The younger archivist, Anna, whom Elliot had taken on as an apprentice a year earlier, sat at the edge of the circle, an attentive presence whose palms already bore the faint ink stains of practice. The steward took his gloves off and placed them gently into my hands for a moment. These have kept me honest, he said. Use them when you must, but do not be afraid to let a new hand make its own marks. He then walked around and placed his palm lightly on books as if imparting a blessing. It was nothing public, nothing ostentatious, simply a practice of passing a care forward. People applauded as they do, politely, at the end of a civic thing. The moment passed like the bell toll of the church, and life resumed its measured rhythms. Anna stayed. She was quiet but quick with stitches. She measured without fuss and had a habit of humming under her breath when she concentrated. Elliot welcomed her as an apprentice, and eventually as a colleague. The steward's absence was felt in the archive's quiet corners, but Anna's presence added a clean energy. Her questions were direct, and her hands were steady. She learned, as anyone must, the small liturgies that made keeping possible, the right way to fold a sheet so ink would not bleed, how to make a little head cap so a book might not fray, how to tuck letters into sleeves so their edges would not catch on anything. The foundation wrote again after the steward's retirement, this time with a different approach. They offered not merely money but a program of public engagement, exhibitions, talks, a traveling case with the smear negative at its center, accompanied by explanatory panels about modern anxieties. The letter arrived perfumed with the polished language of institutions that know their museum catalogs. Eliot, after a night of turning the page of the letter beneath the lamp, declined once more. When he told me, he did not do so as an act of bravado. He placed the typed pages face down and folded his hands. "I will not let them put names in a glass case," he said. "We will do what we can with what we have." The economist and my father did not like the refusal. The mother and my mother wondered whether this was a gesture too stubborn for our ledger to bear. For my part, I had to reckon with the fact that refusal would mean practical austerities. There would be no easily funded conservation suite. We would instead patch budgets, teach apprentices more slowly, ask neighbors to help with time rather than gazettes. The ledger's life would be slower, perhaps less documented in public, and definitely less bankrolled. A few practical measures followed. The cook suggested we pare down the larger entertainments and convert them into small philanthropic teas to keep Anna employed and to raise a modest fund for materials. My father adjusted his ledgers to include a conservation column that had a modest target. The solicitor suggested a reserve clause, a small fund to cover emergency repairs. He wrote it in, as he always did, with a kind of cautious elegance. These were not dramatic sacrifices. They were decisions about what we would make room for and what we would let go. And yet the cost of refusal was not merely financial. There were afternoons when a note arrived from a journalist who wanted to interview us about the curious decision, and I found myself choosing my words with the same care I used to choose a dress for a public appearance. No one wanted to read an essay about the ethics of marginalia. They wanted a sound bite about the couple who had refused money. We learned, slowly and perhaps painfully, that the refusal itself became a spectacle of a different kind, a public image that our quiet practices could not easily dissolve. It was in the months after the last refusal that the letters Eliot had been copying began to matter in a new way. He had always been methodical. He copied letters for their content and for the texture of the handwriting, for the way certain names sat on a page like a promise. But there came a packet one evening, neatly tied with a ribbon that had once been the color of a faded sky, and when he placed it before me, I felt, once again, the small shock of receiving something at once ordinary and essential. "This is a set of letters from people who were almost invisible in our records," he said. "Read them, if you will." I read by the lamp. All the language was unsurprising. Requests for small favors, notes of gratitude for a meal, a line about a child learning to write the letter R, and yet they formed a chorus that altered the ledger's meaning. The seamstress wrote of a habit of leaving a scrap of cloth inside a mattress for the child of a neighbor who had lost father and means. The carpenter wrote about giving a few boards to rebuild a pulpit after a storm. A midwife's note mentioned a girl who had never had her name spoken at the registry and asked whether we might record it. Each line was an act of attention, a tiny insistence that someone be counted. I felt something shift then, not like a revelation, but like the untying of a knot. The ledger had never been only a set of fiscal entries. It had functioned as a map of mutual aid, a record of hands extended. Eliot had known this, but the letters made it visible to me in a way press statements had not. They were not grand narratives. They were stitches in a life. When I looked up, Eliot's eyes were watching me with a kind of patient courage. He did not say, "See, I told you." He simply had the look of someone who had been keeping that map for a long time and had finally, gently, invited me to follow. In that invitation lay the pivot of our life together. Not a courtroom confession, nor a headline-clearing photograph, but a shared reading of the small obligations that make a town live. We began then to act in small public ways that did not court spectacle. We hosted a names tea, a modest monthly gathering where we called out entries from the ledger and, when possible, invited their living descendants. We invited the seamstress's great-granddaughter, a woman with a box of frayed lace and a quiet laugh, to attend. She brought with her a trunk of sewing tools that had belonged to her ancestor. I sat with her in the kitchen, my social training and my new apprenticeship folding together, and watched as she ran her fingers over a needle worn to a smooth point. She told me stories of a woman who mended more than clothes. She mended reputations by refusing to let anyone's name be forgotten. The pantry ledger, which had once been a dry household account, took on a different life. We asked the baker to note when someone had taken bread for free. The gardener noted when he repaired a bench for the church. The pew repairman recorded which boards he had replaced. These entries were not meant for public display. Their purpose was practical, to keep track of mutual aid so that obligations did not fall into the hands of anonymity. Names were recorded, followed up, and sometimes met with an envelope of aid. The work felt like small liturgy. Anna, the younger archivist, began to lead a weekly workshop where she taught basic repair techniques to anyone interested. Mr. Hollis provided materials at a discount and would, in exchange, accept a list of names to whom he might present modest loans of books. The seamstress's great-granddaughter organized a small class for mothers on how to darn socks and to keep a simple record of garments mended. Practical knowledge, but also a way of reasserting presence. Not every act was magnanimous. There were moments of tedium, the daily grind of securing sleeves and sewing end papers, the petty arguments about who would bake for a meeting. There were also small moments of joy, the gardener returning, cheeks ruddy, to tell us he had found the name of a man who had built a child's swing and that he'd come by to tighten the bolts, the parishioner who brought a pot of soup after we had stayed late on a repair night. Those episodes added up not to a narrative of triumph, but to a slow architecture of attention. My mother, observing all this with the mixture of pride and unease she carried for everything I attempted, organized a charity tea that was deliberately small. It was not aimed at daughters of noisy benefactors, but at neighbors, women who knew the seamstress's name, men who could tell stories about the carpenter's short laugh. The tea raised enough to buy materials for another season, and it had the pleasant effect of being less performative than our usual events. It allowed us to practice hospitality in a restrained form, and to teach the town that stewardship could be made visible in ways that did not require banners. The solicitor wrote his addendum into the house papers and left us with a clause that read like a promise. The custodian will acknowledge the role annually. The custodian may decline at any time. Delegated duties should be performed with the same fidelity as the core choice. He inscribed it with careful, legal ink and left us to our home. The paper remained a document of our intentions, but it did not replace the daily practice. The law could hold the outline of obligation. Only we could fill it with human care. Time, the slowest instrument in our home, did what instruments of habit usually do. It altered perception. The smear never left the negative. Sometimes I took it from its envelope and held it up, tilting it under lamplight to see how weather changed its edges. Once, after a long rain, I walked the town and noticed small differences. The baker now nodded across the counter and told the seamstress's great-granddaughter where to find a scrap of good thread. The gardener had taken to tightening the benches in the parish quietly each month. None of these were publicized, but they mattered. They were the sort of things that, over the years, make up a life. The steward's retirement became an extended apprenticeship more than an ending. He would come by sometimes to speak to Anna and to the few others who still wanted to learn the unglamorous crafts. He taught not only how to repair, but how to listen to entries that were fragmentary, how to discern whether a marginal note about a boy frequently absent required a school visit or a warm coat. He taught them to ask gentle questions, to contact people quietly and without fuss, to be wary of spectacle. As the years moved along, there were quiet successes. A young man, once noted in the ledger as having been lent a set of books, went on to become a teacher and returned one rainy afternoon to offer free reading classes. The seamstress's great-granddaughter, with a trunk now smoother from use, opened a small workshop where she taught mending and charged only what a neighbor could afford. Anna became a steady hand in the archive, and when the steward took a final farewell walk into the fields one spring morning, she accepted the small private task of being the house's resident keeper in practice, while Elliot retained the custodial appointment in the legal sense. We continued to refuse the foundation. That decision shaped us in ways both practical and character-forming. People asked whether we had made the correct choice. I stopped answering with moral pronouncements and began instead to show the ledger's work. I invited people to a reading, to a tea, to a simple repair evening. When they came, when they looked at the ledger and saw their own names or a neighbor's, recorded with the small dignity the margins offered, they often wept quietly. Not all of them understood the ethics at play, but many understood what it meant to be seen. There were costs. We lived more modestly. My mother complained less about frippery and more about cash books. My father, in his softer moments, would tell me that while he missed an easier ledger, he admired how the entries now pulsed with more life. The solicitor kept visiting to update clauses and to suggest prudent wording. We would smile and keep to the paragraphs that allowed for practice rather than performance. Sometimes, when I could, I would take the negative and lay it over the table. The smear was never explained. There were rumors, as durable as the rain, that it had been made by design, that it was a sign, that it was a spiteful act. These were stories people told to make sense of uncomfortable absences. We did not correct every rumor. Sometimes silence is the kindest answer to gossip. Yet the negative remained not as an accusation, but as a reminder. Some things cannot be fixed by a good phrase. Some things require endurance. On one wet afternoon, years after the first smear, the steward sent Anna a small note asking her to come to his cottage. He had found an old envelope in a box that had been misfiled, a child's pencil drawing with a name written in a careful child hand. It was, he said, a reminder of why he had wanted to pass things on. When Anna returned, she had new ideas for how to make the archive more accessible without turning it into a display. She proposed workshops on marginalia, a community board where names could be requested, and a monthly reading hour open to whoever wished to attend. Elliot and I agreed. It felt right in the way that the right garment sits on the shoulders. There were, inevitably, moments of friction, still. The town still found the odd journalist who wanted a scandal, and a few neighbors could not believe that we refused apparent largesse. Politics sometimes bled into our conversations in a way that made me bristle. But the core of our life had shifted. The public animal in me still moved the room when necessary. The apprentice in me still preferred the hush of the archive's lamplight. They did not cancel one another out. They braided together in a way that proved unexpectedly sustaining, and Elliot continued to be the quiet force at the ledger. He did not become a hero. He did not become saintly. He remained, in all his ambiguous humanity, someone who preferred the dust to the podium. He taught, he recorded, he declined offers politely, and he occasionally allowed himself the small pleasures of a well-executed headcap or a basting that held under strain. Once, on a summer evening, I found him reading aloud from a letter he had copied, a letter from a carpenter who had repaired a roof during a storm. He read the line with a kind of reverence. We set our hands so that children might sleep in a dry room. He closed the book as if closing a mouth. We did not, in the end, eliminate the shadow. The title the town preferred, The Socialite and the Shadow That Never Left, kept its shape in the gossip columns for a time, and then settled into a periphery of memory that people referenced when making small talk. But its meaning had altered for us. The shadow no longer functioned as an accusation alone. It had become an emblem of what weather does. It moves across faces, softens edges, stains some places, and leaves others whisper clean. It compelled us to choose a different response than spectacle. Years later, when the steward had finally left the town and Anna kept the keys to the archive, we held the first annual affirmation. It was neither a grand ceremony nor a private communion. It was a small set of acts in which the appointed custodian wrote a line affirming the role for another year, and the family and a few neighbors signed as witnesses. The document was brief and plain. I, name, accept the voluntary custodianship of the ledger for the coming year and commit to the practices of care as we have agreed. It was signed with practical pens and then folded into a small box where we kept the other household papers. There was no triumphant music. There was only the steady rustle of paper and a sense that we had, in our own awkward human way, invented a ritual that made the choice repeatable. On the evening of that affirmation, rain came, as it often does, to remind us how little control we have over weather. Elliot sat at the archive table, his hand moving as if it had the rhythm of a prayer, writing, copying another letter into a small codex. I stood behind him, the negative at my elbow, and when he paused to smooth the page, I placed my hand over his and rested it there. There was no grand pronouncement, no final undoing of doubt, only a simple human clasp. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked him quietly, the way one asks about old dresses in the dark of a wardrobe. He did not look up right away. He pressed the tip of his pen into the paper, and then finally turned his head toward me. His eyes had the small rain-blue clearness they assume when he has been thinking for a long time. "Sometimes," he said. "But regret is not the opposite of grace. Sometimes it is just a remnant of living." We held hands like that for a long time. Outside, rain traced its slow lines down the window. The smear lay in its envelope, the same gray, the same unset weather. Inside, the ledger lay under glass, patient and open, its margins full of names that no ledger alone could ever exhaust. Names that required phone calls, cups of tea, visits, mended hems, and an occasional small loan. Names that required us to be present for the long, unglamorous, essential task of keeping. I am still, in some ways, a social animal. I go to receptions and nod and deliver the sentence that returns the spotlight onto someone else. I still smell the citrus of lemon oil when I open a door. But my life now houses two economies, one of public choreography and one of private attention. They do not easily align, and there is no neat moral calculus that allows us to score points for virtue. Instead, there is a more complicated arithmetic. Hours spent, names remembered, the hands we have taught to stitch. If the smear taught me anything, it is that some shadows do not leave because they are not only the town's business, they are weather that announces the need for shelter. The ledger taught me that shelter is built not by headlines, but by the patient detail of care. Choosing someone, choosing him, choosing her, choosing the seamstress whose name had almost been lost, was never a single act. It was, and remains, iterative. A yes repeated in small gestures. I do not mean to offer this as instruction, but as an invitation. If there is one thing I have learned in the lamplight and the rain, it is that memory is a craft. We stitch it, we mend it, we keep it, and sometimes we refuse to let others exhibit it as an ornament. There is dignity in such refusal and also cost. There is also a grace in the modest things. The pantry ledger, the repaired pew, the apprenticeship that teaches hands to hold a name as if it were a living thing. On nights when I am alone, I sometimes take the negative from the drawer and hold it up to the lamp. The smear looks different each time. Sometimes it is a cloud, sometimes a thumbprint, sometimes a map. I do not know what it will be when I am gone, when hands that are not mine turn its edges. Perhaps it will be a footnote, perhaps not. For now it remains. A weather to be kept company with, not prosecuted as a crime, but treated as a reminder of limits. The house continues to gather the small acts that made its life steadier. Anna teaches a new pair of hands each season. The seamstress's great-granddaughter now runs a monthly mending table in the market square, where no one charges more than a cup of tea and an earnest thanks. Elliot, with his ink-stained fingers, still transcribes letters and occasionally writes to someone who has been named to ask how we might help. He is not a public hero, and that suits him. He is a keeper. Sometimes people ask me whether love can survive such asymmetry, one partner preferring the stage, the other preferring the spine. I do not have a tidy answer. What I know is that love can be remade into a practice, and that practice is sustained by choice after choice. Small affirmations, signatures on a paper, the simple clasp of hands over a lamplit page. Choosing someone is not a single day, but a series of slow renewals. There is a final thing I will offer, as a kind of last modest act. If you have been listening, if you have felt the shape of these small labors, will you do something with me? Leave in the corner beneath where you keep your own things a name. It can be someone whose shoe was mended long ago, or someone whose letter was never quite read aloud. Write it in a small book or on a scrap of paper and place it where you will find it month after month. Make, for yourself, a modest liturgy of attention. I place my hand over Elliot's as he sets his pen down. The lamp throws a halo on the ledger's cloth spine. Rain taps the roof like a small applause. The smear remains in its envelope, weather that will not leave and would not be, perhaps, entirely welcome if it did. In the quiet, with ink on our fingers and tea cooling on the table, we continue to choose, to keep, and to learn how to let the shadow be part of the room without letting it decide the house's life.